Thanks for coming, everybody. I am the substitute host here at last minute, but it's really my pleasure to get to talk and have you all hear from Eddie on, which is why you're all here. This is some housekeeping from the festival, and if I screw it up, correct me. We're going to do those things, so I'm not going to read all that. But San Francisco Zine Fest, should I read all this? Yeah. Founded in 2001 as a gathering place for writers and artists from around the world, but especially the Bay Area. Typically held as a one-day event at County Fair Building in Golden Gate Park. And after 2 years of virtual fest due to COVID, we returned to in-person at our 2022 festival at a new venue, City View at Metreon, where we all are right now. We have over 230 artists exhibiting at the festival with programming including screen printing workshops, zine making workshops, SFPL giveaways, and multiple panels with guests. Their Safer Spaces policy, we are committed to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, or religion. We will not tolerate harassment at SFZF events in any form. Individuals violating the Safer Spaces policy may be sanctioned or expelled from the space or the event at the discretion of any SF Zine Fest organizer. Safer Spaces policy, respect people's opinions, beliefs, differing states of being, and differing points of view. Always get explicit verbal consent before taking someone's photo or crossing other personal boundaries. Be responsible for your actions and aware that they may have an effect on others regardless of your original intent. A safe and respectful community is everyone's responsibility. And lastly, nicely done, wear a mask. That's me. This feels weird to read your own bio, so I am the author of Unflattening, the first dissertation done as a comic book out from Harvard University Press. I run the comic studies program at SF State, where a few of my students and former students are in the house, so give it up for them. And I make, new students too, and I make comics about ideas and philosophy and stuff, and my students do really cool things. So come check us out. But that's not why you're here. Eddie Ahn, our guest of honor for the event, a self-taught artist and creator of Advocate, a graphic memoir published by Penguin Random House in April 2024. For over 15 years, he served as a nonprofit attorney and the executive director of Brightline Defense, a San Francisco-based environmental justice nonprofit. He has also served as an AmeriCorps member, teaching arts and public speaking classes for elementary students in Oakland, Chinatown. In addition to his nonprofit work, his art is displayed on utility boxes and walls throughout the city, and he has been recognized as a cartoonist in residence by the Charles M. Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa. Give it up for Eddie Ahn, and yours. Okay.
It is amazing to be back at San Francisco Zine Fest in this way. I first started tabling. I still don't have the exact year yet, but I think it's 2011, 2012 was when I first started tabling. It was at the County Fair Building again. And what I had prepared for you today was essentially a quick slideshow. It shouldn't take more than 15 minutes typically to walk through. When I give these presentations, I don't read out loud text from an actual comic panel. What I try to do is really talk through the themes, the intent behind my art, and hopefully that'll generate an interesting Q&A later on. I found people can connect to the work that I've done in very different ways. And just to describe even my trajectory at Zine Fest to now what you see as the cover of this book, you'll see the art itself has changed a lot over a long period of time now. So this was originally done in 2011. It's essentially an angry, ambitious talking turtle trying to sell coffee across San Francisco out of a coffee cart. And so a lot of it, has already the sense of place with a map of San Francisco. And then this subtitle is called The Avenues because it was really based on the west side. So you can start to see how the only roads are really highlighted are the Richmond District, Sunset, et cetera, as you know them. Then I evolved in 2015 to 2017 roughly doing kind of science fiction, wish the world. A series of wishes, essentially changing the world was a concept of this comic. It was intended always to be a much broader story, a couple hundred pages. I realized in the scope of my life, I did not have the time to create a 500,000-page epic as I envisioned Akira, for instance, who is a personal kind of influence of mine. But in many ways, my early art career was like full of starts and stops of like great ambitions and often failed execution. But I think that's art a lot of the time too, and I'm happy to describe that journey later on. But I wanted to describe more and more, in creating this book you have before you, Advocate, as a story of my family and how it influences who I am and what I do, even for a living, which is why the beginning pages of the book really start with this photo, and I interpret it in my own kind of illustration style. You'll see a 1953 photo of my grandparents marrying at the end of the Korean War. That's my grandfather in the middle of the photo and my grandmother to the right. Essentially, the unique thing to point out about this photo is there are a number of US soldiers in the top left corner too. So my grandfather served as a translator for both the South Korean and US armies. And his own story was really tragic because he came from a city that was originally part of South Korea when it was demarcated between the Soviet Union at the time and the US, called Kaesong. And then once the North Korean armies invaded, it switched essentially to North Korean control by the end of the war. And he lost his entire family as a result of that experience. So himself, he grew up in many ways very embittered about his life and then was struggling to understand. I think it influenced essentially his own career trajectory, how he built out businesses, tried to build out businesses in South Korea. And then it influenced my mother and father and what they ended up doing in the US. So here you can start to see the immigration history of my family. We started out in Texas because my parents, when they came to the US, they went to the University of Texas in Austin. So I was born there. And then my mother was supposed to be a pharmacist, my dad an engineer. Instead of pursuing careers in those fields, they ended up doing liquor stores instead. So that's me in the left, cheerfully next to cases of Miller Lite. You can also see in the top right corner, it's not that impressive looking goody-goody liquor in the big green lettering. It's actually the much smaller lettering, the CVS lettering, that's right next to the store. So that probably gives you a sense in some ways of my family's trajectory too, very much of an underdog story. And the joke about Texas is they always do everything bigger there. So it's very much a state of big business, big corporations doing their thing. But at the time, it didn't matter. This was roughly the 80s to 90s as a period. It didn't matter because the aspirations of my family were often very entrepreneurial. And you can start to see that represented in the bottom right photo, which was essentially make what money they could from the store, the retail store that they had, invested in my own education was the aspiration. And that's why I did, you start to see the art portrayed here. I did, manage to go to a good school, Brown University in Rhode Island, fulfilling their Ivy League aspirations for me, even as a child of immigrants. And then, in many ways, you start to see how color moves the story itself throughout the book. So in the early days, those childhood photos are represented in red in the bottom right corner. And in the top right, you start to see the early days of my youth when I consider myself green and naive. Color itself is used as a storytelling tool to move time and mood in the story. And that's why by the time you move to the left-hand side of the page, you start to see California represented in shades of red, or shades of various colors, because part of it is it represents very different transitional states of being that I was in. So purple, for instance, itself is literally a transitional color. It's a blend of blue and red, and represented probably the early day careers of my nonprofit legal work, and then transitioning to being a nonprofit executive director. There's a brief golden period I like to think very fondly of in 2019, right before the pandemic. Then there are shades of brown and orange to represent the pandemic itself and the wildfires. And then ultimately, I'd like to think nowadays it's blue, which is a calmer state of being. And the other thing I like pointing out is in this particular set of images is why comics? Why use it even as a storytelling medium to begin with? I think part of what I think about the environment is that the visually arresting nature of it can be persuasive. It can connect with people, which is why I've chosen to use comics as a storytelling medium. The other thing I like pointing out is the gutter, which is that space in between panels. So it's often not about the art in the panel itself, as it is the ability to move the story from panel to panel as well. And then just describing my own trajectory, career trajectory in nonprofit work, I started out in Oakland, Chinatown. I was an AmeriCorps worker straight out of college, teaching arts and public speaking to 3rd through 5th graders. And it was a lot of homework tutorial sessions,
trying to connect with youth, originally immigrants, youth of immigrants, who were trying to essentially make it in American society. And then in the bottom right corner, you can start to see a note from a student wondering even why I was contemplating law school. So at the time I was weighing different career choices. I was like, do I want to continue education work, get a master's in teaching, versus getting a JD, which is the legal degree. And here you can start to see how I was struggling with those choices and even talking about it with my family. I think my family's aspirations were often very kind of transactional in nature and with a kind of appraising understanding of American society. So you can start to see myself trying to describe that nonprofit education work that I was doing with AmeriCorps, saying like, oh, it's about the community getting a better education, and then explain the circumstances of the particular immigrant families I was working with. A lot of these were essentially sons and daughters of immigrant kind of service workers who were working very late hours. And that's why the after-school program that I work for had incredible value in terms of keeping the youth occupied, so that then they would hopefully go on to be motivated to go on to school the next day and have their homework in hand. And then you can start to see in that bottom left panel, my mother's response to that is, well, but how much do you get paid in all this? So part of it is like, I wanted to literally represent through comics how it was a circular conversation. I often found a number of different ways to describe my nonprofit work, and yet would always arrive with that final answer, how much do you get paid in doing this? And I want to say, like, their emphasis on me making money was not in of itself, I want to say, a bad kind of set of questions to ask. I think it came ultimately for them a place of love too, wanting to make sure I was taking care of myself. And I also try to acknowledge it's rooted in their kind of transactional worldview of that liquor store. Bottles are a motif, for instance, that are returned to throughout the book. And then even the idea of ascent, climbing the American economic ladder is represented quite literally in visual ways. So this shows, for instance, a hot air balloon ride. My father would often get free tchotchkes, I guess is one way you could call it, like free kind of stuff from his relationships in the liquor retail industry. And one of them was a hot air balloon ride where he literally got in and then got to fly away. So I wanted to show on the left-hand side how that was also reflected in terms of the economic ladder. In getting a law degree, in me choosing to get a law degree, my parents were initially really excited. They were like, oh, great, you can finally go work at a firm, make a decent amount of money, buy a condo, some kind of property, build up wealth in that way. And then at the end of it all, in that bottom left corner, get us a Mercedes-Benz as a gift. For them, it wasn't really about having a Mercedes-Benz. They didn't need that kind of car. It was always about the gesture and the kind of respect that was implied in making that kind of gift. And for them, like the next kind of trajectory that I chose right after law school was very hard for them to understand, because in essence, it was very rooted in a geography that was distant from them and in communities that were very different from their experiences. And here you can start to see Dr. Espinola Jackson, for instance, a community leader that I worked a lot with in the early days of my nonprofit work. That's me as a young kid back in 2010, graduating from law school. And on the right-hand side, you can start to see how the geography and history of even Bayview Hunters Point, the southeast sector of San Francisco, are represented. There were peaker power plants, for instance, that used to pollute, disproportionately burden that neighborhood. That was part of Espinola's original advocacy, and Brightline joined her to stop new peaker power plants from being built. Local hiring, kind of progressive workforce development policy was really pushed forward by Espinola Jackson's advocacy, and again, Brightline providing some of the technical assistance work to push forward the legal and policy research components of it all. So there was a lot wrapped up into it that was always rooted in community leadership and geography, which is why maps are so frequently featured in the book. And then in the bottom left corner is kind of like the broader state of the nonprofit. The staff has grown a lot since then, and then Espinola unfortunately passed back in 2015, so we do an annual celebration, a commemoration of her memory since then. And here you start to see some of the earlier conversations again. That's Brightline's office on the left-hand side. It's in South of Market, Howard and 6th Street. And then Espinola and the conversations I would even have in her home. So things like power plant siting again, and even the solar, on low-income homes that she would advocate for. So there were, a number of different kind of clean energy workforce projects that Espinal always cared about for her community. And her history too was often being someone who came with an understanding of having been a union electrician in the shipyard that existed in Bayview, and then coming up and then essentially owning her own home and then rooting herself in advocacy for the community around environmental issues. This is now fast forwarding to today, and kind of you'll start to see the dramatic changes in color because this was representing the early days of the California wildfires. But part of it was thinking through our community partnerships that my nonprofit often develops. So on the left-hand side is a really cool local nonprofit called Community Youth Center, CYC, which also has a through line with some of the youth leadership work that our nonprofit does around the environment. And then this also represents some of the early days of air quality sensor siting too that happened back then. So why air quality sensors? In that moment in time was people didn't understand air quality that well in 2020 to the extent that they do now with so many wildfires happening. And part of it was like being willing to go out and do that work hands-on yourself was something I had to take up because the pandemic had effectively isolated a lot of the staff. So part of it was figuring out over a course of time, and then also toggling to different kinds of work as well, like food insecurity work. A lot of the communities that my nonprofit works with tend to be incredibly underserved residents. Single room occupancy buildings. Let me see a show of hands. Do people know what SROs are here? Okay, a good amount. That's awesome. So generally, like in the early days, if you remember, we were all on lockdown. SROs typically have communal kitchens and shared bathrooms. So in many ways, living in SROs was like really difficult during that time where you're not supposed to be fraternizing or being in social settings. So a lot of nonprofits took it upon themselves. This is Self-Help for the Elderly, Chinatown Community Development Center. A number of key nonprofits with kitchens would create meals and then have their staff volunteer to deliver. And Brightline, myself and some other staff members joined in this effort. So you start to see that represented in like climbing the narrow stairwells of SROs, going from neighborhood to neighborhood, from Chinatown to Mission District to, Ocean View. It was all over the city. And then part of what I've also been thinking through too is like the surprising aggressiveness you would even encounter on the street. So this is a sadder page. It's not something I typically talk about in most class presentations. But even as I was trying to deliver the food, you could see someone walk by and say, Chinese fucker. And then the other slur that was used with me as I was trying to cite air quality sensors was, I'm a Jap, slap you. These are really it's really a surprising language even to encounter in the Bay Area. It's not my first encounter by any stretch of the imagination with racism, because in many ways, like Rhode Island, I found to be a surprisingly, intense, racialized place, as well as Texas itself, of course, too, has its own reputation. But for this to happen in a progressive area like the Bay Area was a huge bummer to me personally. And then also, it made me question even why I'm doing the work if it was going to be imposed on me in this way. And I thought a lot about responses even in that moment. I have to say, like, my own responses to these situations were just kind of not being as aggressive as sometimes I have been in other instances. But maybe that's me just getting older and trying to grapple with it all, that it still happens. And the other thing to recognize too is, yeah, these instances happen with me, but writ large, I just feel like in many ways they're drops in a bucket. There's a much larger ecosystem where this will continue to happen if there's not enough social work, community building being done, trying to address it. And then the final pages really grapple with, my father's relationship. So the book is largely about my relationship with my father, my mother, and trying to explain nonprofit work to them and why do all this to begin with. I certainly don't go over with them like instances of anti-Asian hate. I just feel like at times when I've even tried to broach those subjects, it's been really hard for them. They themselves, of course, have experienced a lot of discrimination in Texas, but for me to relay that to them, I think their message to me would just be like, just persevere and carry on. But at the same time, like I have been able to show them kind of brighter spots in my own kind of art creation, community organizing. One example here is like art installations that have been done on the west side of the city. And then surprising moments where my father even collected in that bottom right corner, you'll see the cover of one of my comic books. I never thought he really cared much for my comics until he essentially had just a single van collecting all his possessions in the US before he moved back to South Korea, where I found one of my copies of my comics just laying around, which was really, touching for me to see. And then again, going back to kind of the visual nature of my comics and how it ties in those themes of family, community, environmental policy, is this trip I took to Denmark, you'll start to see represented in blue. And then this is like a trip, to go see offshore wind facility that I did take with my nonprofit. And again, if you go back to this image, right, of the hot air balloon and that notion of ascent, and how I try to connect it with my father has often been one of economic infrastructure, creating jobs, trying to put it in more crass commercial terms in hopes that he'll understand. The bottom right corner kind of reflects a current state of mind, which is, this is a sadder part, which is covered in the last chapter. He's been undergoing dementia and has been really struggling. You can start to see, like, when I try to explain those connections to him, his response is, I don't remember any of that hot air balloon ride, just go get me a cup of coffee. So part of it is like, it's not from my father not loving me or anything like that, but it's made me very reflective about memory, how people glom onto information and absorb information, and how difficult sometimes my work can be in that broader context. The final bit really ends, the final pages of the graphic memoir really end with my grandfather and the reflections, again, about his legacy. He frustrated my mother a lot, and that's covered in the book. And part of it was trying to, again, think about legacy and what we leave behind in the short lives that we do have. And without sounding too grandiose about it, I hope it's something that makes people at the end of the day more generous toward each other, this book, and thinking about how can we reach beyond our own, identity, our own sense of community, and just try to bridge what is clearly a really divided society today. And I don't think, whatever the result in, say, 2024, this election will be, I do think our society at large is in for a hard struggle to try to reconcile our differences. And I hope, art is just one mechanism, and comics can just be one mechanism in trying to bridge these divides. So with that in mind, I hope this presentation has been interesting to you all, and I'll hand it back over to Nick.
That's great, Eddie. So I'll just say, if you get nothing else from this book, and you'll get many other things from it, a portrait of an incredibly humane and compassionate person and thoughtful person is going to come through. And I've now seen you in action twice, and yeah, I really appreciate that about it, separate from all the things about it as a comic. So thank you. So I'm just going to ask a couple questions, or a few questions. And you answered many of them, so that's good. I don't have to ask them. But you did answer this, but I think the answer could be a little longer. I mean, if we think, when I grew up reading comics, what I got to read was superhero comics. Like, that's what I had access to, that's what existed, that's what sparked my interest. My own work is far from superhero comics at this point, but we're in this really awesome moment where you see a huge rise of memoir comics, graphic medicine, comics about health and healthcare, and comics about ideas and about science and about. So my question, which is kind of rambling, I see when I introduce these things to my students, like if we look at memoir or we look at health, they just light up, and all of a sudden stories pour out of them. And so you answered a little bit about why comics, but I think, yours is a portrait of you, and it's a portrait as you closed. What do you think it is about comics that's appropriate for this moment, is powerful, is why all of us are involved in it? If you had a longer take on that, if you wanted to try. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it might be useful to also describe its publication history too, and how it ended up the way in this format that it's at now. Which is, when I first started Zine Fest, it was very kind of cheerful, everything do-it-yourself kind of mentality, hand stapling these booklets, drawing everything by hand. And originally, when I even started creating these autobiographical pages, I felt very uncomfortable with myself trying to tell my story in this way. So from 2017 to 2020, I didn't publish anything online at all. It was just me creating, drawing in this big sketchbook, a handful of pages here and there, trying to find out the tone, the kind of feeling of the story. You can also start to see constant color testing, for instance, that I'm doing
hold for
across the page here. And then I still need to use this mic for the camera, right? As
I can hold the book for you.
Okay.
How about I hold the
sounds
book?
good. But part of it, as you can see, is just like constantly thinking through, like the style of storytelling, constant notes to myself. This is probably a more fleshed out page of like, 10 by 15 is usually the dimensions I would draw in. And then thinking through, again, this scene represents like my father getting really sick and his memory loss that's happening. But part of the power of comics, I think, is always like, we have this information on a page. How can we then meld the text and image well enough so that it communicates the audience to a way that's very different? So for my day job at my nonprofit, all I do is read reams of information, like prose all day, like paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of text. I don't think that's the experience of most lay people, and of course, like we're all consuming social media. So in 2020, when I was designing all this stuff for print, the idea originally was, well, maybe I'll start experimenting some of this stuff on Instagram and then posting it bit by bit. February 2020 was when I started posting the first comics. And then I was really surprised by how the audience for it grew over a period of time where I still wasn't sure of the voice. I was still figuring out. And then ultimately the reason why it ended up in the publication journey that it's been on now is like, it was essentially a cold approach from a publishing house to myself without even understanding what the publishing industry was. I didn't have an agent at the time. It was just essentially, hey, have you thought about adapting this for print? When that person had only interacted with it through social media. And that person was Vedika Khanna, who's credited as the editor of Advocate. So it all worked out in many ways, but it was a very hard journey to just kind of figuring it out as I went along, hoping that the comics as a storytelling medium would work out. I did have a belief that it would work out, actually, but I wasn't quite sure if it was going to ultimately end up in some kind of more published form, or if I was going to be still hand stapling books trying to, pass it out at Zine Fest, which is still like, there's a lot of power and value in that at the end of the day. It's a really kind of community. The reason why I love Zine Fest so much is like, it's a very community-driven affair. But to have this on this kind of journey, I think has been really interesting because now I'm interacting with schools and trying to explain environmental policy, again, like really dense subject matter in a very different way.
Great, thanks. So to that question, not the order I was going to go in, but how many of these pages, or did any of these pages come about as the events happened, or close to them? And related to that, how much do you think this sort of comics making can serve as a way to process, whether it's those things you shared near the end, things with your father, to process things you're dealing with in a slightly more immediate sense?
The other thing I really wanted to use throughout the graphic memoir to answer this question was color as a way to create flashbacks and flash forwards in the narrative, and then try to tie it together with themes of generosity, family building, etc. So you can start to see, like I'll use purple, for instance, as a color to try to move a scene, and then toggle to green to try to create a sense of flashback, and then tie my mother's health issues in this page with my own personal health issues. And part of what I was thinking through was I wanted to make sure that each page, so one thing to understand about graphic memoir, of course, is like it's very kind of, it's going to be built on your own perspective at the end of the day, and there's no such thing as like the omniscient perfect perspective when you're trying to build a graphic memoir. And I tried to communicate this to my mother as well, who would read these comics on Instagram, and then she was increasingly nervous as she learned that the book was coming out. She wasn't sure, oh gosh, what are you going to write about me in the book? But part of it was, understanding it's my story at the end of the day, and hopefully it's told in a way that's respectful to the folks around me. But part of what I wanted to accomplish was enough of a distance in terms of time from the moment when a story happened to when I told it. And the technique used in that was color, really, to toggle back and forth from moments of time.
Great, thanks. So you raised it, and it's certainly a theme in the book, is making money. And I just saw one of my students on the floor who's got a day job, but is doing a lot of comics which aren't making so much money. What maybe we have aspiring makers, we have established makers in the room. What do you have some thoughts about? You know where I'm going with the question, I think.
Yeah.
I don't, but you do.
Cartooning is a really hard practice, just acknowledge that. It's incredibly laborious. Even if you compare it against writing prose, which of course is also a difficult practice to get published in what's called the Big Five, the New York City publishers, it's a long journey to get any book published. But comics itself is not only difficult to create, it's hard to edit too. And then layer on to that the monetary expectations behind comics. It's just a different market at the end of the day, which I think is part of the reason why it's still relatively small outside of the DC Marvel realm, which nowadays, of course, it's built. The way I think about DC and Marvel is like it's built-in IP, intellectual property, where it's just an ecosystem that feeds onto itself with movies, toys, merchandising, etc. But with graphic memoir, indie comics, who knows? I feel like I've been very lucky to be on this journey. If I had like a piece of advice, is like trying to find your own voice early on is really important. And then to negotiate the financial aspect, it can be hard. Like for me, like even as a nonprofit worker, I never made a lot of money to begin with. So part of it was like just accepting my circumstances. And then I talk about it in very kind of cute ways, like burrito math.
Yeah, that was great.
I would eat like 4 or 5 burritos a week as a way to survive. And if you stretch out 4 or 5 burritos, that's like 2 meals. So that takes care of like 10, 15 meals, depending how, leanly you're trying to eat. But at the end of the day, like I also recognize that people have to take care of themselves too, to some degree. So it's a hard balance. You have to essentially like strike a balance between making enough money and surviving, and then be able to do the work that you love.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that gets at some balance.
There's no answer to that question, right? I'll jump off that for just a second. I think you just said something. You said it in the talk, but you also brought it up again now. Sometimes I'll get students who come in and they their first semester, they're like, I want to make my masterpiece comic. I want to make a 200, sorry Marcel, I'm not looking at you. I want to make my 200-page comic, right? And I'm always like, you know what, we're going to make 75 pages or so of comics of the semester, but we're going to do it, I'm going to be sneaky about it, because we're going to do like 6 today on 3 different projects. And it feels like your career was doing all these small things to find your voice. Yeah. And then when you've found it, then you're ready to tackle that next thing. I may have answered my question already, but you can add to it.
I told this story in part at the Zine Fest reading at Silver Sprocket the other day, which was when I originally started creating comics straight out of college, I was delusional. I started creating 5 different stories. I was going to create a crime noir comic, a horror comic, comics biography of Malcolm X. I had all these ideas. And it turned out like I was just so distracted by trying to execute so many ideas. I really didn't get any of them done over the next 3 or 4 years. So I do think like at a certain point, by 2011, I was starting to focus, and I was like, okay, it's a small story and at its core, it's like this talking turtle character. But it's really, in my mind, hitting on a lot of themes that I wanted to talk about as a storyteller. And the turtle itself, again, like an angry, ambitious character, in some ways was patterned after the failures of my own grandfather too. So in ways that really drove me. It's obviously a fiction story because there's no such thing as a talking turtle, or is there? Yeah. But really, it's meant to be a very personal story to me. And I just think using art as a vehicle in that way, in some ways is like a nice form of processing information. It's therapeutic. And maybe in that way, art is cheaper than therapy too. So that's right.
You have something to show for it too. That's good. I have more, but I'm going to end my part with one last question about page 66, if we could.
Okay.
So in my teaching and making, I'm very much interested in the formal things of what you can do with comics, and maybe you could say a minute you say what the page is about, and I'll say the reason I grabbed it.
So this chapter covers kind of my own early health struggles I was having in law school, where I was having periods of blindness in my right eye. And then ultimately where that ended up was I ended up having a scleral buckle at a very young age, 25, I believe, maybe 24. Most people who have a scleral buckle are well into like their 70s or 80s because retinal detachment can essentially happen from two things. It happens through old age and macular degeneration, or it can be like you're a boxer and you get punched in the face really hard. So I wasn't punched in the face really hard, thank God. But part of the struggle in this page was showing the effects of that surgery afterwards. So once you have that scleral buckle surgery done, you effectively lose vision out of the right side of your eye. For myself, it was out of the right side of my eye. So it shows at the top panel kind of like the peripheral vision that I've lost, and it shows in the panel underneath what it would look like if I had perfect vision. So in essence, like I joke about it by the final panel that, you know, I don't live in a jungle environment, so it's not terribly,
Yeah, but it's such a great, I mean,
survival.
thing is we get lots of people saying comics and storyboards are the same thing, and this is really showing how they're not. The spatial nature of how he's using the page here, where he's got, you know, part of the scene and then that right half is just a blank box with a word balloon, which you just, you know, if you read it the first time, it's kind of like, what's happening? And then you see the same exact scene, except now you can see the full panel with the same word balloon, and it now becomes revealed. So how can a comic make you feel the kind of thing you went through? I think this is just a great instance of it. And there's other in the book, but this one jumped out at me when I was rereading it. Maybe with that, let's hand it to you all. And yeah, so who's got a question? And do you want to, should I bring the mic to him, or should I just have her stand up and ask? I can move. My legs work well. I'll come. I don't know what the...
Maybe I'll just yell out the answer.
But I can come back to you, though.
Shuttling back and
I
forth.
gotta have something to do.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
Hey, hello. So my question is, since we're talking about graphic memoirs, when I was in college, like 20 years ago, one of my professors talked about the concept of the archives when it comes to building off of a history, whether it's personal history or a collective history. And I'm curious, and you kind of touched upon it in your presentation, but I was curious about in creating those flashbacks or in creating, or you personally recollecting some of these past memories or memories of others, how did you kind of navigate, if I can use the archive metaphor, archives where there's missing pieces, and how do you fill in those blanks, or pieces that are maybe worn or not the memory. You remember it one way, but it's not quite what it is, but you have to make a narrative from it. How did you kind of navigate that process?
That's great. Thank you.
The biggest concern I had was my mother's reaction to the comic after the book, because part of it is me imposing my own interpretation of my mother's relationship with her father, my grandfather too. And there's stuff that my mother would tell me orally that I knew that she had told me, but I also know that she's a very sensitive person herself. And then even, I touch upon this in the book itself, there was a moment where she's going over, my grandfather, when he passed away, he essentially left about 10 to 12 like handwritten pages about the arc of his entire life. And it's essentially, it's not organized in any way. It's essentially just, you know, from top to bottom, just blocks of text, like outlining everything that he's done. And it almost reads like kind of a deep explanation of his own life, in an attempt to try to explain to his frustrated family around him, like why he did what he did. And my mother, even in sharing that information, or sharing those pages with me, refused to translate it. And my own Korean is conversational at best. So one of the things that a friend was able to do was take the translated pages. I actually scanned them in and created a PDF, then translated them and created like a fuller English translation, so then I could understand and try to piece together. But even then, it's like 10, 12 pages is not enough to cover an entire person's life. Yeah. So I think maybe this is a joy in comics, is that there's only so many pages you can draw at the end of the day, and I was limited by page count. So I took what I could, I tried to highlight what themes I could, and it may not be perfect at the end of the day in terms of encompassing all of his life or all of my family's feelings, but it's enough. And I think one maybe nice story to share is that my mother has read it and now has proclaimed it's an excellent book. She has cried at each reading after reading it 3 times. So I thought that was like really nice that she even
would read it repeatedly. And nowadays, apparently, she keeps it on the coffee table just to read whenever she feels like it. So thank God for that, by the way.
The next one, but I want to say one thing. If anybody's familiar with Kelsey Ervick's The Keeper, it's a memoir of growing up as a soccer player in Title IX, but she saved, or her mom saved, all the her homework assignments from kindergarten and first grade, and every time, as we're trying to cull my kids' stuff, I'm like, well, maybe we should save this. They're going to write a memoir someday and need all this stuff. But yeah, it's a tricky question, and thank you for that. Who's next? Oh. This is my student whose name I'm still learning.
Loud.
All right.
I probably don't need that.
Okay, you can.
My question is more philosophical, I guess, but I'm a nurse and I work with public health, and I sometimes feel like this is just fun. How do I justify making art when there's all this other work to do? I don't know if you're still working as a lawyer.
I am.
Still working?
I still work for the same nonprofit.
Activist work is really important. Sometimes I just feel like, another book in this massive library of books. I don't know. I'm just wondering how you felt about that.
Oh.
Because it took me a long time to get to the point where I could apply for an MFA, and now I'm like, does this make any sense at all? Doing art, when all this stuff is going on.
I will admit to having periods of self-doubt generally about my nonprofit work, art in general. Maybe the bigger question is what's the point of it all? And what's the point? I think it's very dark by nature. I'd like to think that the moments of human connection is what really drives me and makes it all worthwhile at the end of the day. So when I have that in my nonprofit work, in many ways it makes up for the more difficult aspects of it, whether it's anti-Asian hate or even the drudgery, of nonprofit work and how repetitive it can be sometimes. So that's all. I try to look for the moments where there are really, moments of true connection and happiness. And with the art too, again, Zine Fest itself has been a joy because of the way people congregate in the space and they just share the art. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece or Pablo Picasso or Cezanne or whatever. It's more just about being able to share that even act of creation, which I think is really nice too. And so for the MFA book you're pursuing, it sounds like working, and I want to emphasize, it doesn't have to end in a publication journey with a publishing house and all that. If it's something that just satisfies you, and then you can share it with friends, broader community at, say, a literary festival, I think that's always worthwhile too, and you can find a lot of joy, validation in that too.
That's a great answer. Another? I'll come to you.
Okay. I'm curious about the editing process.
Yeah.
It's not Dickens who was paid by the word. And you're so limited. You have, what do you show in visually? How do you take a conversation that's 12 sentences long and make it 2? What do you look for that makes it? What is it? Do you combine sentences? And I'm just curious about the editing process that you do, that we can still get what you're trying to say without pages and pages.
I've always viewed comics as a language to be developed and learned over a period of time. And my own comics, there's a wide range of influences to cite. And then I also read not just American comics, but European comics, Japanese comics, manga, and just try to, each form, each region has its own kind of feel and style of storytelling to it that are infused throughout. And this comic book, if you look at it really closely, is littered with different references to other comics too. So that helps, I think, that I am widely read at this point, and instinctively, the other way I work is also kind of odd for a lot of cartoonists. I have some ideas on how I'm going to create a story, but essentially I don't script anything out prior. I have some loose ideas, and then I'll just adhere to this 10 by 15 page structure, and then I'll just draw it and then I'll write in my head as I go along. And then later on I do rewrites even as I'm scanning in each page and then creating it in Photoshop. So it's all just kind of building the plane as I'm flying it as a way of storytelling. Not a lot of
actually, this is true of Comics Experience with Brian Hibbs. Brian Hibbs is the owner of Comics Experience, who's interviewed hundreds of cartoonists to date. His comment was like, everybody has a different way of creating comics, and that's part of the beauty, and it shows a lot in the work too. In terms of someone else editing my comic, I thought you were going to go in the direction of
I'll
like,
go there too.
yeah.
I don't know how
But
anybody can do that.
it's hard, and part of the reason why I landed at the publisher that I did was because I did believe in Vedika in the way she had approached me early on, was talking about, she herself was widely read in comics too, and I think it's easy for anybody to come in and be like, well, why don't you, that panel is interesting, it would be great if you drew 20 more pages of it, you know, or why don't you take that panel out, but then it messes with the rest of the layout that's already intended, right, with the cartoonist head. Vedika was really respectful about it, but I also recognize any work of art needs edits at the end of the day. Like it's also unhealthy, I think, for artists just to be in their own head producing work, especially something like this, which is so complex, marrying text and imagery together, that having a third party, in other words, who understands a creation enough, they don't have to be a cartoonist themselves, but making sure that they can edit certain portions of it and then maintain the overall integrity of the piece is really important too. So ideally they believe in the vision, in other words, even
I think it's
prior to
really
that.
interesting for me, who's extremely new to this, to hear it's a different language.
Yeah.
It's a different medium, you know, because I'm like, well, how would you put a memoir into comic? No, it's not. So thank you for that. That's really interesting.
I highly recommend Nick's class.
It's not my place to answer now, but I will say the space of comics so much forces you to be a good editor because you just, you have no choice, right? So you learn to say things more efficiently or differently. I think, do we have time for one more? Do we have time for two more? Because I have two hands that just shot up when I said that. For you?
Hi, I'm just curious how your art has evolved. I mean, you were a lawyer, trained as a lawyer, and then you came into this.
Sorry.
And how you like sought learning in this.
How I sought learning in this?
In comics, I think.
So with teaching myself even how to draw, like 80% of my art, I would say, is done through photographic references. So just even studying photographs, learning how to draw through it. So this earlier stuff is essentially me drawing what I thought a turtle should look like, what a person should look like in my head. And it shows, cheerfully, like it's not as precise as I would like nowadays, like anatomy, perspective, coloring. These are all components essentially I've learned over 10 plus years of just really sinking in the hours. To give you a sense of time, each page is like 20 to 30 hours worth of work. Writ large, this is well over 5,000 hours, in other words, of drawing, essentially over a 5 to 7 year period, depending on how you do the math. So it's a pretty brutal process too. But the thing I have talked about is the time trade-off. So earlier on, when I originally took over my nonprofit back in 2015, I was working 120 hour work weeks, which is essentially like a law firm job. Like you are going to sleep at 1 or 2 at night, and then you're waking up at 5 and 6 just to do this, XYZ pass. And the reason for that was my nonprofit was just essentially starting out. I wasn't the founder. I was trying to figure out a way to build up my nonprofit, and I had to do 5 or 6 different jobs. I was just, and my attitude was whatever it takes. Nowadays, I work a more manageable 50, 60 hours a week, which seems leisurely in comparison. And then, as a result, I have a lot more time. Oh, and the other thing to note is like the pandemic itself was, if there was a silver lining in the pandemic, it was like having a ton of time to draw too, because I wasn't going to like social events as much anymore. Yeah.
I'm going to go to you.
One more question?
Yeah. I'm going to say my favorite quote from their class. The student said, "Comics are a lot of fun, and comics are really hard." Is that what she's? And that's really accurate.
It might kind of be a follow-up on how you learned, but I noticed that you're mentioning a lot about comic as kind of a different language, or the interest of the gutter in between panels. So it definitely reminded me of like McCloud's idea of comics, and it sounded like you were very systematic about colors and things as well, braiding different colors together. So I was curious where your influence came from, more of the technical, formal side of cartooning.
Thanks, guys.
I have a lot of inspirations again for comics work. Maybe just to cite a couple off the top of my head. Darwin Cook, for instance, who is known for The New Frontier, the Parker Crime series. The Parker Crime series actually is quite good. It's essentially Darwin Cook taking this noir story and translating. It's written in prose, but he's translating into several comics volumes. And the coloring mechanisms used in that were heavily influential for Advocate. Darwin Cook doesn't use color in the same way I do, but and for me, I wanted to try to use color in a way that I found to be different, at least in the space. But yeah, technically that was a big influence early on. The other thing to note too is like I will admit to being more of a studied drawer. I'm not the most expressive drawer at the end of the day, and part of it is like because it's all done off photographic reference. It does then influence even the way I draw with like a technical with pen. Then I try to layer it on with like colors and then a brush pen to make it more dynamic. But longer term, I've been thinking through like if I was to do a fiction comic, what would it look like, and what artist would I want to try to I think all artists like imitate, copy each other. Just like, what's that famous quote like? Good artists copy, great artists steal. So at some point, like I'll find another artist perhaps to steal from to create what I'm hoping will be a good fictional work.
Great. Should we?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's our time. So you're still signing books, right?
Yes.
So you should, if you haven't already, buy a book and get him to sign it, and you can probably follow up with any other questions. And thanks for attending, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks, Eddie. That was great.
This is really awesome.
Yeah.
One last piece of business.
Oh.
My name is Lauren. I'm one of the organizers for San Francisco.
Lauren, do you
Zine
want
Fest.
that?
And
Hey, Lauren.
I'm gonna come by.
Hey, Lauren. I think I know who you are, Lauren. Hi.
Hi. And we've been really delighted to have Eddie as our guest of honor this year. And Eddie has also been honored by the California State Assembly.
Wow.
And I'm going to read what the Office of Matt Haney has written. So in recognition of San Francisco Zine Fest 2024 Guest of Honor, on behalf of the California State Assembly, I extend my highest honor and recognize your environmental justice leadership and artistic contributions to the Bay Area zine community. Thank you for your advocacy and leadership at Brightline Defense, and congratulations on the successful publication of Advocate, a graphic memoir of family, community, and the fight for environmental justice.
Hey. In the middle of that, sorry. I don't.
All right, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thanks.